I have prepared a interesting video which actually fits where we are right now quite well, because it is a Hakuna Matata YCS Dortmund hand trap and staples analysis. So we can find out and think about what hand traps and tech cards people were playing for YCS Dortmund, and we can discuss how that would change most likely going into the new format, or how that would impact the new decks, right? That's something we can talk about. And the Hakuna Matata videos are always excellent for that type of stuff. So let's find out what were the most common hand traps at YCS Dortmund, and so on and so forth, and how that might change post Age of Overload. I think that's a very good discussion to have at this point in time, because we've just talked about the upcoming decks, so we can talk about how that will impact people's changes, people's decisions on what hand traps and what not to play. I think that's going to be an interesting kind of segue.
Hey guys, so of course YCS Dortmund just concluded over the past weekend, and as usual I wanted to highlight some of the most played hand traps as well as staples in the topping deck list that were available to help you prepare for your next events. And so definitely a huge shout out to YugiohProDeck.com, a really good resource to find all these topping deck lists. And of course a big shout out to my sponsors as always. Definitely makes my day if you guys use those discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh singles or supplies, so definitely go check them out. Now in terms of the topping deck lists that were available for this video, I could find 37, which
okay, we are only basing this on 37 YCS top cut deck lists. We didn't have all the deck lists, which is, I mean, it still is a majority.
Keep in mind that
1 year anniversary Keldo pitch Agido response. Blood Rain, thank you for the full year. I appreciate you. Welcome back. Thank you so much.
You know, it was top 64 at Dortmund, so basically we had a little over a half, and this is basically what the pie chart looked like among the deck lists that were available. So kind of for the most part I think reflects what the top 64 was like, but at the same time, again, when you look at some of the most played hand traps and staples, keep in mind of, you know, some of the deck lists that were actually available for this video, which might influence that. Alright, so let's just provide an overview of the hand traps. And so we actually had a median of 6 hand traps in the main, ranging from 0 to 15. This is actually a lot lower than the 9 that we saw after YCS Brazil and Vancouver that I had done. So certainly a downward trend in that.
This is interesting to me. I mean, it's I played no hand traps, but I'm also not included in this because I didn't top. But the only reason I didn't play hand traps was because I didn't like hand traps in purely. I think in other decks, I liked hand traps a decent amount. But this is one of the things that could explain. It could just be as simple as that. This could be the explanation why a deck like Rika was able to go all the way through top 64. Because we saw in the breakdown, there was only one Rika in top 64. Rika was not that successful overall at YCS Dortmund. It's just that that one player got through all the 6 matches in top 64, and not many hand traps in people's decks could be a reason for that, because there's like you know, the hand traps are definitely very strong against Rika, and if people play board breakers instead, they might run into a problem against Rika. So this is one of the things. It's always funny how these kind of trends always line up with the results of a tournament, right? It's like it's a very natural thing. You look at the stats afterwards and you're like, okay, it makes sense that Rika was able to perform under this, like in this top cut, right?
But in terms of the side deck, about 6 hand traps in the side as a median number. This was slightly higher than the 5 that we saw at YCS Vancouver as well as Brazil.
This also makes sense because if you go down on hand traps in the main deck in this format, you probably have to go up on hand traps in the side deck. Simply because there are a bunch of decks in the format where you should be afraid. Like you want hand traps for sure, right? You need hand traps in your side, at least in the side deck, because, you know, you cannot simply ignore Minadium, Rika, Infernoble, all those decks. You can't ignore all of them. That's not something you can do, right? Or like, I mean, you should not do.
Now, in terms of board breakers, it actually kind of essentially was the same between main and side, ranging from 0 to 14 with a median of 5. So definitely a little bit lower than what we saw at YCS Vancouver as well. Now, in terms of the most played hand traps in the topping deck list that were publicly available, we are starting with Ash Blossom. Once again, as usual, still a lot of people main decking it rather than siding it. Of course, you know, you are potentially playing into something like Talents and Thrusts, but at the same time, it's a very good generic.
I mean, Ash is the best hand trap, I think, in the format right now. I personally think Ash is the best one. Can you maybe do a tier list for decks when a Rise Hard comes? I'm gonna do a Master Duel tier list soon, yeah.
Hand trap right now, especially with the rise of tier elements, and Ash can be actually pretty good against them, especially trying to stop something like, let's say, the Yugioh or the Kelbeck, just like those millers, just so you prevent them from snowballing. And also, even on like your turn, let's say, and your opponent just happens to have that Havness, you can also stop that. But of course, against Unchained, it can actually be quite impactful as well, and you actually saw a rise in like a lot of the branded lists yet again, and of course, Ash goes really hard against those strategies. So next we have Droll, which is actually kind of interesting, right? Because it was actually seeing a decline in play the last month or so, with, for example, Vanadium not being as popular as people maybe thought they would be going into the Dune format. But now...
I saw a lot of Droll. I played Droll myself. I think Droll was like a perfect side deck card for this event, which story checks out. Most people are siding it, not many main decking it. I think it was a perfect side deck card for this format, because it's actually quite good against some decks, quite bad against others, which just makes for a pretty solid side deck card, in my opinion. I think this makes a lot of sense.
It's actually come back, and I don't think, while it is interesting, I don't think it's actually surprising, because you do constantly see this with Droll, with, when people don't really respect, decks like Vanadium, for example, and like just take the Droll out of the side deck, then those decks can kind of start thriving again. So you kind of have to keep them in check every now and then. So still something that you might want to watch out for in your next event. We also have Bestial Druid's Worm, of course, with Magma being put to 1, you're going to see a lot of Druids.
This one is... Actually, no. 7 main deck is probably just from Dragon Link, right? Mostly. How many Dragon Links was it? We have... This includes 3 Dragon Links. Oops. Spoilers. My bad. My bad!
Where I'm not really a huge fan when tier limits are meta, just because then it becomes where like a lot of decks start converting towards, they either play Shifter or they just play a lot more
Gabe
Bestials,
and Henry mained it in tier. Right.
Out there. Next, we have Imperm, which has certainly fallen, and it's funny because I was actually, not too long ago when I was doing like a hand trap staple tier list video, I was talking about how, I was watching Jesse Cotton's staple tier list video and how, he wasn't like a huge fan of Imperm, and, I think that also still makes sense. It's not like the biggest impact card right now, but I think because it's just such a generic staple, and I think a lot of us, admittedly by habit, kind of tend to put Imperm in anyways, but you know what, it's still nonetheless still a pretty good card. We also have the other Bestial and Magmanaut. It is at 1, but you know what? It's still solid. It can, especially when you have Dragon Link.
It's funny that Magnemute is less popular than Druid's Worm. That's a stat that if you told me that like a couple months ago, I would be like, nah, that's crazy. Like Magnemute is so much better, so much better of a card than Druid's Worm. But yeah, I mean that's, I guess. The thing is just like against Unchained, right? Against Unchained, Magnemute is worse than Druid's Worm because you simply need the removal. And if you go Magnemute and then they make Caesar after, and then you search a Druid's Worm in the end phase, you can't summon it, right? So that's fine. And then Imperm makes sense for it to be a mostly main decked card. I can't really think of many scenarios where you would want to side deck Imperm. I think Imperm's main selling point is that it is quite flexible and quite solid in most matchups, so that usually makes for a pretty good main deck card, right? That is its quality. The quality of Imperm is not that it's insane against everything, it's just, or like against any specific deck. It's just, its strength is that it's a good all-rounder, and that you can easily main deck it for that.
As a tier 1 deck still, and you're gonna main deck this anyway, so you know what, still comes hard, especially with the rise of tier limits. Next we have Nibiru. So now this has actually fallen in favor of, let's say, something like Droll and Lockbird. So Nibiru,
this is a card that I think has dropped in main deck popularity a whole lot because everyone realized that it's actually not that good against Unchained, right?
Was still pretty popular last time I did this, like you have like Unchained where Nibiru can be pretty effective. Of course, they can sometimes go into Nightmare Griffin after getting Nibiru, which is really FTK against a lot of different strategies out there. So I think, this is another one like Droll, if you don't respect it, it's going to eventually come back. So you got to just kind of keep those things in balance. So next we have DD Crow. Now this is a card that actually saw a huge decline in play ever since the Bestials came out a year ago. Because the Bestials for the most part served as like a better replacement for DD Crow, especially in that time where we had
Crow's on the come up for this current format. Well, I guess the current format is not going to take that much longer But DD Crow being like significantly better than Bystials in some spots is actually interesting. Like the fact that DD Crow can hit the blue dog from Unchained, the fact that DD Crow can hit the target for Pearly Lily, and so on and so forth. Like I think DD Crow is a pretty interesting card. It's not the most impactful hand trap at that, but like it's pretty solid. And if the format had been going on for much longer, I think we would have seen more DD Crows because it covers like I said, Unchained and Pearly, but it also covers Tearlaments, which Bystials are also good, but they don't cover Pearly, for example, right? And it's like it's pretty good against almost any deck.
Elements being so rampant. But now, you know, with DD Crow, it can also be useful because Pearly, for example, they can try to exceed summon by using, you know, like whatever Pearly spell, quick play spell in the grave, and you can at least get rid of that and try to stop that. And again, with the rise of tier elements, DD Crow is quite good on top of the Bystials, especially with Magnum Out being put to 1. And then finally, you also have something like Flunder that can actually play typically one copy of this in the main deck because they can search it. So now, speaking of Flunder, we unfortunately have Shifter still up here. So, and the interesting thing is I'm actually noticing some of the Sprite as well as some of the branded lists playing Shifter again in the side, which is something we kind of briefly saw a year ago as well because of tier elements. And so it's weird because, you know, of course, these branded Sprite, those kind of decks, they don't play optimally under Shifter. It's just more so that they can at least kind of get by under Shifter. And because against certain matchups like tier elements, Dragon Link, where Shifter absolutely kills them in those situations, that's why they're still opting to side for it, even though they don't play all that well under it either. So, you know, Shifter, obviously, in my view, very toxic card. Hopefully it does get addressed on the next ban list, but for now, we do have to deal with it. So next we have Spooky Dogwood. Not really seen that much, but really just kind of played as a time card, unfortunately, with just how the game works nowadays. And of course, Phantasme, definitely not seeing that much play. Initially had a little bit of hype a couple YCS events ago because of, you know, for example, Unchained, Dragon Link, a lot of Link summoning, so you can get some.
Man, if Thrust wasn't the card, dude, no one could stop me from playing Phantasme. No one could stop me from playing Phantasme. If we didn't have freaking triple tactics Thrust, man, I would be siding Phantasme in every deck right now. My god.
Kind of advantage, or rather, at least sculpt your hand is more better way to say it, but still sticking around. Next, in terms of the most common board breakers / staples, you know, you have Feather Duster, like not much to say, just a really good overall back row wipe. We are also going to cover just Talents and Thrust together. They're very good. Only. I think Talents, honestly, there's like a lot of debate for it to at least get limited at some point, hopefully soon. I think it is a very strong deck going first or second. And Thrust, I'm honestly surprised it's not in more topping deck lists. I think with the power of Thrust, you can basically just get access to any kind of like, you know, board breaker or Floodgate going first or second, and just really flexible and an incredibly strong card. We also have Lightning Storm, similar to the likes of Feather Duster, just generic board wipes. And then you also have D-Berry. Unfortunately, it is still good against something like Pearly, which, you know, while it did have kind of a disappointing showing at the YCS Dortmund, you know what, it's still a tier 1 deck, right? And then speaking of Pearly, we also have Herald of the Abyss. That is actually seeing a decent amount of main deck play, presumably because these are probably in decks that are playing Thrust, just so they can just get this off and they have a main deck out to something like X-Pearly Noir, which a lot of decks might not have. And realistically, even if you're not playing against Pearly, like the Herald of the Abyss can probably get rid of other kind of like problematic monsters anyways. You know, it serves as like a board wipe. And then we have Book of Eclipse. This is definitely seeing a decline in play because last time it was actually quite popular, and
this is a super interesting stat. This one here particular is a super interesting stat because it shows how like this card like couple weeks ago was probably like 95% main deck rate in like every single deck was playing it, right? I still think the card is pretty good right now because I mean it was just one of the best Arise hard outs, but it also coincidentally, you know, it's good against Pearly and it outs the Caesar XYZ. And it's always, compared to other board breakers, it's like a powerful card going first because you can use it in your opponent's turn because it's a quick play spell. So I think Book of Eclipse is here in less than a third of the decks. I think that's still, I would call that underrated right now. I think Book of Eclipse is a card that people were like, Arise Art is gone, I can take it out of my deck and then just replace it with something else. And And I don't think it's mandatory anymore, but I think there are some decks that still want it. I think people are maybe going back to it at some point. Well, I mean, the format is going to change again for like the next set in 2 weeks or less than that. So who knows what would have happened if this format was going to go on for much longer? But my personal opinion would be that Book of Eclipse would probably rise in popularity a decent amount going forward. It is one thing that's worth noting is that it's not particularly good against tier limits, though. I mean, going second, it's fine. Going second, it's fine against tier. You can just disable all their stuff. But going first against, maybe it's just fine against tier. I wouldn't consider it a great card against tier, but it's not terrible.
Especially Book of Moon was actually more popular than Book of Eclipse, but now that has completely kind of reversed, and if anything, you don't really see too much of Book of Moon, at least in the topping deck list. So Book of Eclipse can still be good against Pearly, I guess, if they didn't hard make the Noir on their turn, and still pretty good in terms of going second in general. We also have Xyz Encore, so a lot of kind of like dedicated Pearly hate. I mean, Xyz Encore, I was actually kind of surprised it saw a little bit this amount of play still, because, you know, at least with Kashtira as tier 1 in the previous ban list, you know, this was still something that can be used against them, and that was, you know, the most represented deck for the most part. But I guess it's still sticking around at this point, but, you know, only a side deck card if it is played.
I think one reason why people still kept playing Xyz Encore. The number is 11, by the way. 11 out of 37, because I just realized you guys can't see. Is because I think a lot of Unchained players, for example, were like, I can use Encore against Pearly, but I can also use it against decks that make Dweller, for example, right? That was one thing that was solid reasoning for playing a card like Xyz Encore over another card, like Book of Eclipse or Herald of the Abyss in your side deck. Most people played multiple outs to Noir, though. I think rarely people just relied on just drawing Encore or losing. I think a lot of people played multiple outs to it, and that's how Encore made its way into side decks. Plus, decks like Tier or Unchained can out-Dweller with it, so that's just another bonus reason, right?
And then we have Kashtira Fenrir, which of course now that we don't really have Kashtira, at least not right now, in terms of like topping decks, you know, Fenrir, we're back to kind of seeing this again as just like that generic staple that a lot of people were running.
Not that many Fenrirs, but still, I mean, pretty good showing. 10 decks, main deck Fenrir out of 37.
You know, in terms of it can serve as a board wipe, going second on break boards, attack, and also banish cards face down. And, you know, going first, it like constantly serves as like a wave, additional layer of interruption, and actually helps you maintain hand advantage as well. So really good. And then we of course have Super Poly as well. Now keep in mind that there were a lot of branded lists at top that were part of this video, and they're more likely to play Super Poly. That's probably why I made it this high, because otherwise,
this one I straight up, I mean, I guess I understand like tier limits and branded decks that play this card. Outside of tier and branded, I think this card is straight up ass this format. But I guess in tier and branded, it's okay. Yeah, no, in tier and branded, it's okay. And both of those decks had a decent showing at the YCS. So that's probably where these are coming from, right? That's probably where the Super Polys in the statistics are coming from.
outside of those branded decks, I don't think Super Poly is really worth playing, right? I mean, against Pearly, it's not that good. Against Unchained, it can definitely come up. Against Tearlaments, I honestly don't find it that good and coming as a branded player because, you know, Rukalis will just come back. It didn't really do anything. I mean, again, I guess if they had something like, I don't know, Winda and another fusion, like maybe like the Grapha action deck monster, like then sure, it's useful. But of course, Winda doesn't necessarily always come as like their turn one board. I find often it comes actually during like middle of like, while you're trying to combo and then they bring it on, you know, like you're on the opponent's turn. So Super Poly, I think it's all right. Next, we have Evenly Matched, which is certainly a card that's been on the decline lately.
Yeah.
So against Pearly, of course, they can just keep the...
We talked about this in the Board Breaker tier list that I made. Evenly does not seem very good right now. It's not terrible, but it is like, it is significantly dropped in power. For like, the top decks are just not that weak to Evenly right now. Another card that could have been one of the reasons why the Rika deck had success, because this card is actually pretty good against Rika. All you need to do is somehow bait the Regulus, and then you can evenly them, right? So that is it makes sense that evenly is so low, But once again, that could be one of the reasons why a deck like Rika was in a decent position.
So it's not getting rid of that issue. Against Unchained, you know, they can always keep like the Caesar, and a lot of their cards will just kind of float back. Against tier limits, I mean, realistically, they may just have like the Grapha extra deck monster.
I played an evenly for crossout. But okay, yeah, maybe they made. I saw some one of evenlies for thrust or crossout in deck profiles, so maybe that's even. Maybe it's even like people didn't even play 3 evenlies; they played like 1, right? Which is even less than it would seem.
Also,
like.
They do have access to Crown post side at least, and you know, assuming that you're probably only playing evenly post side anyways, at least only 2 deck lists were main decking this card, especially, which could come up if you are main decking Thrust. Next, we have There Can Be Only One, which of course can be very good against Unchained. It can be really good against something like Flunder and Dragon Link as well. And it is a Floodgate that typically a lot of like the branded list can play, especially in the side, or maybe even sometimes in the main deck. And similar to that line is also Zombie World, which is definitely been popular lately because of Flunder.
Look chat, we hate Floodgates. We hate Floodgates, but Zombie World is based because it kills Flu. Fuck them birds. 9 Zombie Worlds, beautiful.
They can really hard lose to this card when they just cannot tribute unless they're zombie monsters. It can also actually hit something like Dragon Link as well, and even Unchained, you know, it prevents them from going into something like Yama, or even, let's say, like the
Zombie
Caesar.
World Giga
Zombie World, especially popular again in Branded, just because Branded Fusion can actually send something like Banshee, and so it's a lot more easily accessible.
Kills Cybers too. Kills Cybers too, and kills plants. So one of the most based cards in existence, actually.
Droplet, which was not seen in too many lists, but at the same time now with the new ban list, with, you know, Rise are kind of out of the mix, and you know, you can actually send cards to the graveyard as cost
7
more
plus
easily.
1 is 7.
Yes, Droplet is definitely going to see some more play, and you have to get used to that. And then we also have Change of Heart, which is, you know what, pretty generic card. Definitely another card that you can just add off of.
I like how this line perfectly lines up with this line. That's very pleasant. That's very pleasant. It should have been 50-50 though. If it was 50-50, it would have been Pog champion. Like if there was like 8 people with Change of Heart, 4 and 4, 4 main, 4 side, that would have been whew.
Thrust as well, and against something like, let's say, like Unchained, or even like T-elements where you don't want to like pop anything, like being able to just take and then especially helping you OTK is certainly very nice. Alright, so lastly, I just wanted to cover some tech choices that were seen in like a small number of lists. And so basically we had something like Spellbound, Hatronade, as well as Gravekeeper's Inscription.
Yes.
And so if you're not too familiar with Spellbound, I guess it kind of serves as like a worse way of playing D-Barrier, at least going first. But the good thing is that you can actually play this card going second at least. It is a quick play spell, and certainly something you can use against certain decks that, you know, tend to like go into their extra deck mechanics.
Okay, so the reason why I use Spellbound is because mostly for going second, actually. It's like, it's good going first, but it's also good going second, because you can prevent a couple things. We've already talked about it during my deck profile, which isn't on YouTube yet, so I guess I'll repeat it. Going second, you can use it to stop Fluanderees from tributing their small birds. You can stop Chimera, branded Chimera, from going Chimera Fusion into Guardian Chimera or Magnum, because Guardian Chimera needs a monster on the board. Magnum needs an extra deck monster, which is also, they can't have that in hand. The same is true for Dragos Dapelia, right? So this card is actually really good going second against Chimera. It's also good going second against Flu, because you can Spellbound. Wait, did I say Flu? No, I meant Pearly. Pearly, if they want to go purely leap into Spellbound, you can simply chain. I'm confused right now. If they want to purely yeep into Noir, you can chain Spellbound. Okay, now we got it. You chain Spellbound to stop them from ranking up, which is good. And honestly, this is a card that we could be on the lookout for this card after Age of Overlord. Now that I'm thinking about it, this card could be good against like all of the SP Little Knight stuff. Maybe it is a card that we can keep in the back of our heads for the upcoming format a little bit, because it is, like I said, it's good against a lot of the decks already. And if IP Little Knight, SP Little Knight, and IP Masquerena join the fray again, then yeah, it does stop IP Masquerena. Yeah, if your opponent has an IP Masquerena and you start playing and they activate it, you can chain Spellbound and then they can't link. So interesting option.
mechanic like on on the opponent's turn essentially. And so certainly want to also highlight that discount code for card bars as well as tier 0 games. You can use code Hakuna5 for 5% off on Yu-Gi-Oh singles and seal products, so definitely go check those out. We also have Hatronade. This was seen in that sprite list that top by Samir. I guess it's a way where you can kind of try to clear back row without like popping them, because again, something like Unchained or Teal.
I don't really know why this card is considered good right now. I don't understand it. I saw that Ding Kang Fum played it, but I honestly am more confused by that than anything. I don't think this card is particularly good right now.
Certain effects for their benefit. At the same time, just keep in mind this only kind of bounces like the set spells and traps. So if it's like something like a Floodgate, like I don't know, there can be only one skill drain, they can just flip it and it will just stay on the field. So you have to kind of keep that in mind if you're going to be able to play it. It kind of depends on like the meta as well as the actual deck.
It removes Unchained back row.
And then lastly,
look, that's the part about the Unchained board that I'm the least worried about, is its freaking back row. I'm worried about the Unchained Soul of Rage and the Caesar and the Sharvara in hand and all that kind of stuff. I'm not concerned about the freaking Scrap Dragon Trap card or whatever.
Is the Great People's Inscription, which kind of was actually floating around back when Unchained first started becoming like tier 1, because you can kind of like completely prevent them, especially when let's say you're going first and you activate this. Like, how is your opponent really stopping this, right? Like, are they playing side frame Delta? Probably not. And so now with Tearments also being in the mix, this can technically be good, I guess.
Yeah,
but
no,
at the same time, this was
it's a potentially pretty powerful card against those two decks. The only thing that's holding this card back is that not many decks can play it, right? Because it has to be a deck that doesn't need the graveyard at all. So pretty much like the shifter decks can play this card, pretty much, right? And start of main phase is also kind of a problem. Start of main phase is kind of a problem for it because it means you cannot find it with like Prosperity. You can't draw into it with any other draw cards. If you ever like, you cannot thrust for it. That's another big deal. Yeah, that's a good point in chat right now. So the card is good, but it's only few decks that can use it. Most of the top tier decks can't really, and yeah, that's just holding it back a little bit, but it is a good card.
Seen in one
Josh I'm not asking for it to be better. I don't want it to be better. I'm just explaining why the card has been like on the come up, but not that much.
And so I don't think it's going to be like a very popular mainstay at all. Anyways, guys, that was it for the most played hand traps and state.
That was interesting. I like that. Honestly, though, while the stats were interesting, they were kind of like it's a weird bit of data.
I'm really a huge fan
because most of these cards have just been, everything sees some amount of play. Right? It's kind of looking at these hand trap and non-engine stats and whatever. It's kind of like looking at the overall format right now. It's always like freaking super split pie charts and everything, right? It's kind of like that with the tech cards as well, right? Like if you were to make like a pie chart with the popularity of all the staples, like hand traps and board breakers and whatnot, you would end up with a very split image as well, which makes it hard to prepare for, because like it's not like nobody plays hand traps, it's not like everybody plays hand traps, it's like everyone plays some hand traps. Like the average amount of hand traps, it's 6. The average amount of board breakers is also 6. So like some people play hand traps, some people play board breakers, some people play neither, some people play this or that, some people play the Floodgates in their side deck, so you need some outs for that. So like if you're like preparing for an event in a format like this, you're like, okay, my deck needs to be good against like at least like the more popular decks here, which is like everything that topped in multiples is like 3, 6, that's 10 different decks that you need to prepare for. And then your deck needs to be able to deal with some hand traps, it needs to be able to deal with some board breakers, it needs to be able to deal with some floodgates, it needs to be able to deal with some lingering floodgates, because everything is here, right? It's a super diverse format, everything is there, and now good luck, have fun finding a deck that's good into tier, Unchained, Dragonlink, Pearly, Flu, Branded Vanadium, Branded Chimera, Labyrinth, Vanquish Soul, hand traps, board breakers, floodgates, you know what I mean? It's like, it's tough, right? It can definitely be tough to draw conclusions from discussions like this one, right? And yeah, that is tough. That is tough. But moving forward for Age of Overlord, just to put some perspective on this thing, it's very hard to predict. It's very hard to predict what exactly is going to happen. I would say hand traps might go up in usage simply because Vanadium gets a significant boost and people will probably be scared of Vanadium. People will probably be scared of Vanadium, and that could cause cards that are already, like, Droll Lockbird is already in people's side deck. I think that's only going to go up from here. I don't think people are going to take Droll Lockbird out of their side deck. Right? If you, like, you know, like, if like 60-70% of people were already playing Droll Lockbird before Age of Overlord, there's no way they're going to take it out. Right? It could even find its way into more main decks. Hand trapping tier also looks better than trying to break the board. I do agree with you there. I think hand trapping tier, even though hand traps have historically never been great into tier, I think now there's a world where you would want some hand traps, right? Because ashing the millers is really good. Imperming Herald of the Diviner is also pretty strong, I think, because you don't make it level 6 and you don't get the mill 5. DD Crow and Bestials are looking nice on them. I think you're onto something there. I think hand trapping tier is probably better than trying to board break them, because simply the deck is like, if the deck goes off, it's just pretty crazy. It's pretty hard to play into it. Right, because like the amount of extenders they have is also not that many, right? Because Sharon is limited. They can still have, of course, like Pearl Rhino and stuff like that. Like tier, I think tier can play through hand traps with some hands. It's just a very hit or miss deck, right? But that's just what you sign up for when you play tier. So that's that. Hand traps against, and that's the thing with Unchained is hand traps are not technically necessary against Unchained. Like, Unchained is one of those decks where you can just let them play and board break them, but hand traps aren't bad against it, right? Like an Ash against Unchained can sometimes end their turn. Imperm against Unchained is solid because worst case you just keep it for your own turn and negate Caesar or negate Griffin, and then it's fine. So Ash and Imperm are always going to be solid, and if other decks in the format like Vanadium require you to run hand traps, you're not going to feel bad about playing hand traps into something like Unchained, right? You're going to be like, oh, I'm just going to play Ash and Imperm instead of like Thrust, because Thrust is pretty much useless against Vanadium, but they're both okay against Unchained, right? So yeah. Scream, Tier Cash, Sharon with Pearl Rhino, the deck can play through hand traps decently well. It can. They're not like, hand traps are not a guarantee to work against tier elements, but there's definitely a chance. Like, there's definitely some hands of like tier elements that are going to be like just crumbling to hand traps. And you have to think about what the alternative is, right? Because let's say your opponent has a hand of like Scream, Sharon, Pearl Rhino or whatever, right? If you're not on hand traps, but you're on board breakers instead, you think you're gonna win that game? Probably not. You're not gonna beat that with a talents, right? Like you're not gonna beat that opener with a talents. If they go off, they go off, and they're not gonna lose to one board breaker, right? Tier has never lost to board breakers, right? So if they have one of those crazy hands you're describing, if you don't have a hand trap, you're also probably gonna lose, right? So I don't really know what the point there is, right? Or the point that you're making is like, yes, they can play through hand traps sometimes, but that doesn't mean you have other alternatives than trying to stop them, right? But yeah, there is a world where if something like the Gabriel Nets version of tier elements, which only ran one Diviner, no Baron, and it ran no King of the Swamp. If something like this becomes popular, then we would probably just go back to Nibiru, right? Because Nibiru hits that deck very hard. Nibiru is also decent against Dragon Link. Nibiru is probably decent against Mannadium. I don't know the exact combo lines. There's probably some lines that play around Nib, but I would say generally Nib is going to be good against Mannadium, probably, from what I've seen. So that is a world where we could go back to Nibiru if that's the case, right? And then Nibiru is just going to be good against here because you can just, they don't play King of the Swamp. They don't play King of the Swamp. You can get them. They make early Toad. There's like, I don't think the tier deck can consistently make a super early Toad with Bahamut Shark. It can, but it's like you need to mill Rhinoheart, which is not always a guarantee.